The story of Ishmael's birth is one of the most intriguing and twisted moments in the Old Testament, and it unfolds against the backdrop of the lives of Abraham and Sarah, a couple who, despite God's promises, faced years of frustration due to their childlessness. The story of Ishmael's birth is marked by divine promises, hasty human choices, and consequences that shaped not only the life of a family, but also the destiny of entire nations. The setting of despair and hope. Abraham, originally known as Abram, and Sarah, his wife, whose original name was Sarai, lived with God's promise that they would be the parents of a great nation. However, time passed, and Sarah remained barren. They were already advanced in age. Abraham was 86 years old when Ishmael was born, and the hope of having a child seemed increasingly distant, despite God's promise. This context of waiting and uncertainty led Sarah to make a drastic decision. In those days, it was common for a woman to be unable to bear children if she could offer a servant to bear offspring in her place. Sarah decided to follow this practice and gave her Egyptian servant, Hagar, to Abraham, in the hope that through her God's promise would be fulfilled. Sarah's decision and Hagar's role. Hagar, Sarah's Egyptian servant, was young, and her position as a slave left her vulnerable and powerless to make choices. When Sarah gave her to Abraham to bear a child, Hagar had no say or agency in this decision. She was used as a means to an end, a common practice at the time, but one that brought emotional and spiritual complications for all involved. Hagar's conception happened quickly, and upon realizing that she was pregnant, the young servant began to look down on Sarah. This contempt was not simply a matter of female rivalry, it was a reflection of the power tensions and conflicting emotions that arose within this complex family arrangement. Sarah, feeling humiliated and betrayed, blamed Abraham for the situation and began to mistreat Hagar, who, in despair, fled into the desert. Hagar's encounter with the angel of the Lord. In the desert, alone and desperate, Hagar met the angel of the Lord, a divine messenger who comforted and guided her. This encounter is one of the first biblical records of an angel speaking directly to a person, and what makes the narrative even more remarkable is that God chose to speak to an Egyptian servant, showing that his care and attention were not limited to the main protagonists of the story. The angel told Hagar to return to Sarah and submit to her authority, but he also brought a powerful promise: her son, Ishmael, would become the father of a great nation. Ishmael would be a strong man, whose hands would be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. This announcement was not only a promise of prosperity, but also a portent of conflict and resistance, characteristics that would mark Ishmael's life and legacy. The birth of Ishmael. In obedience to the angel's direction, Hagar returned to the home of Abraham and Sarah and, some time later, gave birth to Ishmael. The name Ishmael means "God hears," a reflection of Hagar's suffering in the wilderness and the comfort she received from God's promise. Ishmael grew up under Abraham's watchful eye, and during the early years of his life, he was considered the heir to God's promises. The birth of Ishmael, however, did not bring the hope for peace to the family. He represented both the partial fulfillment of God's promise and the impatience and human failings of Sarah and Abraham. For 13 years, Ishmael was Abraham's only son, but he always carried with him the complexity of being the fruit of a hasty decision, a symbol of the tension between God's promise and human attempts to hasten God's plans. The future consequences. Ishmael's birth marked the beginning of a long-lasting conflict that would echo through the generations. Years later, when God finally fulfilled his promise and Sarah gave birth to Isaac, the son of promise, the family dynamic changed dramatically. Sarah demanded that Hagar and Ishmael be cast out, fearing that Ishmael would threaten Isaac's position as heir. Abraham, grieving, followed God's direction to grant Sarah's request. Hagar and Ishmael were sent into the wilderness again, but once again, God did not abandon them. The angel of the Lord appeared to Hagar, assuring her that Ishmael would survive and that a great nation would come from him. Thus, Ishmael grew up in the wilderness of Paran, became a skilled archer, and married an Egyptian woman, fulfilling the destiny prophesied for him. Ishmael's legacy. Ishmael is considered the ancestor of the Arab peoples, and his lineage became vast and influential, fulfilling God's promise that he would be the father of 12 princes. His life is a testament to the complexity of divine promises and human actions, a rich narrative of suffering, perseverance, and divine intervention. Ishmael's story invites us to reflect on patience, trust in God's timing, and the consequences of hasty choices. It illustrates how God can transform difficult circumstances into something greater, keeping his word even when human actions seem to get in the way. Ishmael's journey is, in many ways, a lesson in redemption and purpose, showing that even in the most complicated situations, there is a divine plan unfolding.